to the Swindon Festival of Literature, or rather the virtual online Swindon Festival of Literature. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we do hope that everything is well where you are. We're both pleased and grateful that human ingenuity, cutting edge science and digital technology make it possible for this show to go on, well, at least go on online. Today's guest tells a fascinating, disturbing and gripping story of how three sisters, his mother and his two aunts, grappled with what they felt to be a lethal heritage. He addresses questions that continue to press in on us today, questions of identity and where each of us feels we truly belong. He does so in his book, How to Be a Refugee. Here it is. Have a look. Okay. Please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Literature online welcome to international author and visiting professor of philosophy at King's College London, Simon May. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you, Matt. I'm delighted to be part of this year's festival.
That's wonderful. We would have liked to have invited you live to Swindon because Swindon in the spring is really rather lovely. In fact, have you ever been to Swindon?
I've been very near Swindon and I've seen it from a distance from the M4 many times on my way down to one of my illustrious former teachers, Roger Scruton, who lived in Wiltshire. So, you know, like many beloved beings, I've seen it from a distance only.
And you'll be pleased to know that the late Roger Scruton was a good friend of the festivals and spoke at it many times. And he's in a farm just down the road from us.
Indeed, indeed.
So next time you'll have to call in on us.
Will do.
Thank you.
Okay.
We better get on to the topic in hand, your newly published book, How to Be a Refugee, which tells a fascinating story and asks key questions, some of which we'll discuss once you've told us a little bit about the book. So over to you, Simon.
Okay, Matt, thank you. Well, just by way of preface, I want to say that one of the things I've been fascinated by since I was a teenager is the difference between integration and assimilation, whether of indigenous minorities or of immigrants. And I think it's a question that has assumed much larger dimensions today in a world of migration where, if I remember correctly, some 80 million people worldwide are forcibly displaced, of which 26 million are refugees. To me, integration and assimilation refer to very distinct phenomena. So integration is about social adaptation, learning to speak, dress, behave, and so on in the manner of the host country. Whereas assimilation is something more internal. It's an adaptation of the soul that can become so extreme that one sheds one's original identity and the cultural memory that goes with it. One, so to speak, forgets who one is. One erases one's awareness of it. And this phenomenon is close to my heart and my origin, as I grew up the son of two German Jewish refugees from Hitler, whose families, especially on my mother's side, had assimilated to their German habitat where they'd lived for centuries so intensely that they were in many ways lost when they arrived in the very different culture of the UK just before the Second World War. And though I was born substantially after the war, they passed on that sense of insuperable displacement to me. They fled Hitler's Germany, of course, because of their Jewish ancestry, the very thing that they had, the case of my mother's family in particular, all but obliterated. And this was obliterated long before Hitler came to power. It wasn't just an adaptation after 1933. But of course, suddenly this very identity became a huge issue for them because it was the obsessional focus of the Nazis. Though my mother's father, my grandfather, had converted to Protestantism already before she was born, just before she was born, and though he thought that he had repudiated his Jewish origins as decisively as it was possible to do, This did not interest the new Nazi regime, which was entirely focused on race, not religion, so that a Jew who had become, say, a Christian or a Buddhist was still a Jew for them and to be cast out of society and eventually liquidated, which is exactly what happened to my grandfather. Within just a few weeks of the Nazis coming to power, he was expelled from his job as a lawyer and deserted by many of his friends and colleagues. And just a few months later, he died of a broken heart in my grandmother's arms. Gradually, Jews were not only forbidden to work, but as is well known, they were stripped of all civil rights and of their very identity as Germans. Yet my family, actually on both sides, were German and felt German to a degree where there was no other meaningful sort of belonging available to them. Because as I say, they had really obliterated the other side of their identity, which was the Jewish heritage, which of course goes back thousands of years. Then they came to the UK. And of course, in the UK, just before and during World War II, the one identity that was most problematical was being German. So now their German identity became something extremely problematical and in effect to be hidden as best as possible. To the extent where German Jewish refugees were actually, which is bizarre perhaps to our ears now, because they obviously hated the country that had expelled them, they were deemed to be so-called enemy aliens in the UK. They were in a legal limbo, forbidden to take paid employment, and stateless. My parents were actually both stateless for a whole decade between 1938 and 1948 when they got British passports. And they were also under nighttime curfew for much of the war because of being deemed enemy aliens. And I recount in the book an episode where my mother once unthinkingly broke the curfew. I won't go into the details now, but in any event, that got her arrested and thrown into a police cell for the night. A misfortune that turned out to save her life because that very night a German bomb struck her boarding house in London. So I thank her breaking the curfew too for my existence. In any event, the main reason I wrote this book was out of intense interest in what it is to be a refugee and how one adapts to multiple identities. But I also had a more specific motive, which is that I wanted to portray what is today still a remarkably unknown side to Jewish life in Hitler's Germany, and actually long before 1933, namely, as I mentioned at the beginning, refusal of your Jewish origin to the point where you manage pretty much to erase all consciousness of being Jewish, something perhaps hard to understand if one hasn't attempted such a self-ethnic purging, which I don't think is too exaggerated a word for it. I wanted to portray how, in reaction to a long history of racial and religious persecution, but also, and maybe even more so, out of intense love for German culture, you somehow purge your soul of this entire heritage until it just seems to have nothing to do with you. In other words, this internal or inner purging of the soul in my mother's family, though I have to say not in my father's, went much, much further than the beginnings of assimilation. It went further than merely thinking of themselves as German first and Jewish second, as many German Jews did. So my mother and both her sisters converted to Catholicism during the 1930s after Hitler's rise to power. That was, so to speak, one major step further in that direction. Then one of my aunts, called Ursel, or her full name is Ursula, like the current president of the European Commission, who was then a young actress in Berlin and who had been from her first theatre job in 1935 and spent years in hiding, somehow wangled acceptance as a so-called Aryan, in other words, as a non-Jew. And she did this as late as 1941 with the crucial help of a very senior, powerful deputy of Goebbels, who was called Hinkel. And as general secretary of the organization, the Nazi organization in charge of all culture in the Third Reich, which was of course strictly controlled by the state, this man Hinkel, who was both an SS officer and state secretary in Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda and the People's Enlightenment, so-called, he was incredibly the very person who Goebbels had placed in charge of purging German art of all Jews. So the mystery was how my Aunt Orzel, then a completely unknown, very young actor, ever got access to someone as senior as Hinkel. And the answer, it turned out, was via a young fellow actor, an Austrian by the name of Jula Duisberg, who I remember as a sort of elderly, advanced middle-aged lady when I was a child, who had recently married the heir to IG Farben, which was then one of the biggest German conglomerates. In fact, I think it was the biggest chemical company in the world at that time. And the point about IG Farben is that it had long supported the Nazi Party financially, and it would go on to supply Hitler's military with key materials needed to wage war, and most notoriously perhaps to exploit vast numbers of slave laborers at its plant just outside Auschwitz, which was actually part of the Auschwitz complex. And it was where many of the prisoners at Auschwitz were marched every day to undertake forced labor. Indeed, a subsidiary of IG Farben actually manufactured the Zyklon B gas used to murder people in Auschwitz and other death camps. Now, there's no doubt at all that the IG Farben connection, which, as I said, came through Orzel's acting student colleague, was the key to getting her a contact with the regime at such a high level. But it wasn't until I actually found a letter only a few years ago in the German Federal Archives, which anybody could inspect, written by Orzel to Hinkel in her own hand, that I learned that she had been personally received by him in his Berlin office. And that was something that either she had somehow forgotten or she hadn't told me when she otherwise narrated this whole story to me many times. And I still find it utterly astonishing that, whatever her connections, that a young Jewish woman whose most recent acting work had been in cabaret venues subsequently closed down by Goebbels, and who had been expelled from the theatre 5 long years beforehand, I just find it astonishing that she finds herself in 1941, which, don't forget, is the year before the Holocaust kicks off, invited for an intimate chat with one of Goebbels's right-hand men, whose job was to rid German culture of precisely people like herself. Needless to say, the very attempt to be deemed an Aryan when you were a Jew, in other words, to fake your ethnicity, was hugely risky. And Orzel's first idea, which she then abandoned, had been to get her mother, my grandmother, to sign an affidavit that she, my grandmother, passed as a non-Jew, though she wasn't. It's all very complicated in our family, had conceived her in an adulterous moment with a non-Jewish Greek violinist who was then conveniently dead. But they didn't pursue that back because such lies were, of course, hugely perilous. Firstly, the very application to be recognized as a non-Jew just drew attention to you. But even more seriously, by the early 1940s, if you were found to have lied about your ethnic heritage, the punishment for all parties to the lie was death. My grandmother did reluctantly, as I heard often from my mother, sign the affidavit, but as far as I know, it was never in any way put to use or played any role in Hinkel's ethnic sorcery. In any event, at first, this extraordinary Aryanization, one of very, very few in the Third Reich, looked like Orzel's liberation from the Nazis' racial hell. She went on to marry into the high German aristocracy in September 1943, and with her Aryan certificate, she managed to return to the theatre and an almost normal life, or as normal as it could be during a world war that Germany was already beginning to lose. But her false identity turned out not to be secure. So in October 1943, which was only 4 weeks after she married and became a countess, her cover was blown and the Gestapo came after her. She then fled to Holland and with the help of the Dutch underground, hid there for the rest of the war. So that's just only a brief summary of her extraordinary wartime story. Meanwhile, my other aunt, who was the oldest of the three sisters, whose name was Ilse, was continuing to live in Berlin, unharmed, where she ran a successful photographic atelier in which she photographed many leading Nazis, among them the Luftwaffe ace Ernst Udet, who had been already a hero of the First World War German effort and was now helping Goering to build up the Luftwaffe. She was engaged, equally incredibly, to a card-carrying Nazi who was an up-and-coming composer of film music, and he'd written the soundtrack to then very famous and popular movies. One was called Kleiner Mann was nu, which means Little Man, What Now? The text to which was the novel by his friend Hans Fallada, a German writer who's actually recently been rediscovered and is back in fashion, having been long forgotten. Anyway, together, my aunt's fiance and her danced evenings away at Babelsberg, which was the Hollywood of Germany. And they were even invited, which I recount in the book, to a reception of artists and writers at Hitler's official residence in Berlin. In a way, the most astonishing part of this whole saga of Ilse's survival in Berlin during the war is that she lived there with a sort of brazen impunity. No one ever threatened her, and she herself somehow felt secure, which sounds incredible, but that's what she insisted. In fact, she felt secure until the Soviet forces invaded the city at the end of the war when Germany was on the point of being defeated. And her real terror was what they would do to the Germans, especially German women, when they took over control of Berlin. At the same time as she was doing all this, and something that none of her circle of writers and artists knew about, was that at night she was hiding Jews in cellars at huge risk to herself. There were, amazingly, a few thousand Jews left in Berlin during the war, many of whom somehow survived by moving from cellar to cellar, spending a night here, 2 nights there, until their courageous hosts. And it was a great act of courage to do that, also punishable by death. Death for the hosts. But eventually they usually threw these Jews to their fate. They just couldn't go on taking the risk. And she did this extraordinarily brave thing together with an Anglo-Irish woman called Christabel Burton, who was married to a German lawyer. And again, it was only recently that I discovered that back in the 80s, the BBC had actually made a film about this, written by Dennis Potter. As I repeatedly emphasize in my book, to recount these extraordinary contortions of ethnic and cultural concealment is absolutely not to criticize them. I mean, I always ask myself, who are those of us who have never experienced racial hatred in any of its vehement forms, to criticize anyone's strategy to survive in such conditions? My family's choices are only my business, because to be born into this strange tributary of the Jewish experience was to be commanded to construct an identity out of everything that I was not. So following the early death of my father, who was also a German Jewish refugee, as I mentioned, I was raised a Catholic by my mother. I was forbidden most of the time, but not always, to identify as Jewish. And I was definitely forbidden to speak German or to think of myself as German in any contemporary sense. But confusingly, I was also forbidden to think of myself as British, though my parents were intensely loyal and grateful to Britain and would never tolerate a word of criticism of it. In fact, everything here was, as far as they were concerned, the best in the world, and certainly better than it was in Germany. And this included, against all the evidence back then in the 70s, its economy. Indeed, so patriotic were refugees like my parents, despite their feeling utterly alien here, that it was quipped at the time that GB stood for German born. In other words, I was allowed to be none of the things that I actually was. So what permitted identity did this leave? In effect, the only permitted identity was to live as if we were still in a pre-war world of German culture that no longer existed. A world which my mother never really accepted had been lost. I think this is, by the way, something that's very common to many refugees and how they raise their children. And so I was mandated, on pain of betraying her and her parents, to think of myself, oddly, as a refugee in the country of my own birth, though of course I'd never fled from anywhere. So it was like being instructed never to arrive at any place, to be, so to speak, a hereditary refugee. And I've been trying to sort that out ever since. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Fascinating. And even though your book is a personal story, you by profession are a philosopher. And if you don't mind me saying so, as a reader, one can't help constantly extrapolating universal and timeless ideas from it, regardless of Ursula and your mother and others. In other words, one is thinking about some of the questions you just mentioned. And the very first question I want to ask you is, you mentioned how members of your family tried to be German, assimilate themselves, and mask or deny or hide their Jewishness in Germany. But there's that story of you going to Samuel's house,
Yes.
and you're oblivious of what you're really meant to do. Does the same not happen in the UK as well, that there is this need to assimilate and hide and mask in order to fit in?
Yes, I think there is. I should just say, I mean, I wasn't intending to say anything general, let alone make any general laws about anything. I was really just intending to portray the story of one family and how they coped with this immense displacement and their love of their original culture. So I wasn't intending any form of general law about anyone else, including any other refugees. But having said that, I do think that there is something to be learned from the intense pressure to appear acceptable to your host culture. It's a pressure that's becoming, and it's something that you internalize. It's something that it's not just an external thing. And I think that's where it becomes so difficult. You know, human beings all, in a sense, act to a degree. They try to be pleasing to their fellows. They profess that. I'm always struck, I've been struck since I was a child. How come there's such consensus on values in every age? You know, there's such enormous pressure on us to profess the same things. But what happens in our soul and in our inner beings is often another matter, and it's more complicated, and there are many more values jostling for supremacy, so to speak. But I think, you know, what I'm trying to draw attention to, if I'm trying to make any general, draw any general conclusions, is this eventual adaptation of the soul and the tortuous process that that can involve. Just a final little comment is that I think things are progressively getting much, much easier. I mean, it's still difficult for all the talk of pluralism and diversity and so on that have become complete cliches. It's still difficult, but nonetheless, we're living in a very different world now, increasingly different world, at least in this country and in many other countries, than we were even 20 or 30 years ago, let alone before the Second World War.
See, I don't want to appear to entirely disagree with you, but there you go, being true to your profession. And even though you've said you never intended this to be anything other than more than a personal account, I'm afraid, Simon, it's much more than that. You've universalized it, whether you like it or not. And your forward to this book ends with 6 or 7 brilliant questions that just take the reader on a journey. And I'm going to read them out so that festival followers can see that this book is more than just a personal story. The urgent question that this raised for me, questions of identity and belonging that seem to be everywhere around us today, are these. Are we not all in some way exiles in an era?
Matt, this is awful. I've lost you, I'm afraid. We're going to have to start that question again.
Well, everyone else
Matt, lost you.
So everything's all right. Let's just carry on. Can the worlds we have lost be restituted, even if minimally, along with their rich networks of meaning, with fruitless and possibly self-destructive efforts to get the clock back? Or is all restitution a pipe dream? Are lost worlds necessarily the unattainable territory of ghosts who powerfully inspire our lives from a great distance, but with whom we can never live or speak again? Either way, how many generations can it take for a refugee family to feel at ease in their adopted country, no longer pining for a place from which they were once uprooted? And at a time when identity is becoming a choice rather than just given, will it get easier or harder to be a refugee? I mean,
you're right.
You asked the question, Simon.
You're right, Matt. I concede that to you. I did, at least in the form of asking a question. I did ask a general question. I think yes. I mean, I can't help saying, I think being a refugee is much, much harder than perhaps is recognized. And I don't want in any way to make any special pleading here at all. I mean, you know, but I do think that it's, I mean, with all due deference to integration initiatives and language teaching and welcomes, which are, you know, nothing wrong with them, but there is an internal process of the soul where if you come from a very strong, different culture, it's just extraordinarily difficult because human beings are very collective animals, let's face it. As I say, I've always been puzzled by just how extraordinarily collective we are for all our vaunted individuality. And you come into a new society, and no matter how much diversity is praised, no matter how much pluralism is praised, the pressure is on to adapt, which in the end becomes a sort of adaptation of the soul. Now, you know, my father's family came from Cologne, which is not much further away from London than Newcastle and is nearer than Edinburgh. Many people coming to this country come from further away, not just geographically, but culturally. And, you know, if my family had a tough job, I can imagine how tough it is for them, even with the best welcomes in the world. So yes, I suppose you're right. I mean, at least through posing the question, I have suggested that there is a general issue here, and it's an issue that's concerned with, so to speak, the soul. It's not just a matter well, as I said at the beginning of my few remarks, you know, I drew a distinction between integration and assimilation. And I think the integration side is a lot easier, you know, I mean, adapting to the customs and the mores and even the dress codes and so on. And all those things that are invisible, you know, our facial gestures. I mean, there's so many aspects of communication that we're not even aware of, but that we acclimatize to. And that's the easy bit, so to speak. And even that can take time. I mean, my parents both remained utterly foreign until the day they died. And they spent, in my mother's case, they spent most of her life in this country. You know, it's, so even that's not that easy, just the external side. But my book, I suppose, yes, if there is any general thing, it's to say, you know, the pressure is on to, as it were, adapt your soul in some way. And that is an extraordinarily hard business. And at least in the experience of my family, it goes on for long after the first generation. You know, I mean, I'm the second generation, and the struggle is on for me too, and it's every day. But I'm not saying it's, yeah, go on.
Yeah, but don't you think, I mean, you're a philosopher and you know the extent to which language can say what we want it to say. And Rainer Maria Rilke said, everything is not so utterable in words as many people would have us believe. Absolutely. And you use the words identity and soul interchangeably. And the term identity is used a lot nowadays. Aren't we all just, I don't know, international mongrels who need to, now that the world is a sort of global village, who need to adapt wherever we are? And the more we dwell on the notion of identity, the harder it will be to reach it?
Well, I think on the first part of the question, I mean, yes, we all are, but obviously some are a lot more than others. And I do think there is a thing called cultural memory. And, you know, however complex human beings, and, you know, one of the things that often saddens me about the identity debates today is that people get reduced to, you know, categories that are assumed to be self-evident, but are themselves so enormously richly diverse, you know, within them. I mean, ethnic categories, for example, enormously richly diverse, you know. And but I think if you live in a location is important, a language is important, which is a heritage that stretches back in your family for, I mean, at least some time, at least say 3 generations. There is this, you know, there's this sort of archaeology in our minds. It's like there are these layers you can dig down to. And I think if there is some kind of historical continuity, that does make an enormous difference, gives you much more stability and much more clarity. I do agree with you that we are all composite identities. We're particularly today in this world, in, you know, all internationalized, whether we want to be or not, which I think is a fantastic thing, but I'm not saying it's without its, you know, complications, especially for those who want to simplify things. But I do think that there are, you know, there's such a big difference of degree between people who are recently arrived or generation or 2 arrived, and those who do have what I call this longer cultural memory just in them, you know, that it almost becomes a difference of kind.
And it's we'll come back to the book in a minute, but I just want to tell viewers and listeners and festival followers, this book has this effect, or had this effect on me, that I'm reading a story about a family, but all the time I'm thinking of something out there in the world, something from the past, something in the present, all the time. And another thing that it made me think, because of the way you talked about assimilating or integrating in Germany and in the UK, was the difference it would make, the difference the color of your skin would make. So in other words, members of your family were able to do it. Now, if your skin color was different or your facial appearance was dramatically different, it wouldn't be so easy. So I'm not suggesting that there's any competition or anything, but no. It shows what a challenge is faced.
Absolutely. And I must say, I'm aware of this every day. I think, I mean, of course, you know, I mean, I referred to slave labor and extermination, and of course Jews who, at least, you know, don't forget, people actually often forget that there are Jews beyond Europe. I mean, there were Jews all over the Arab world. There were Jews in India. There still are great Jewish communities. So, you know, not all Jews, so to speak, are white. But leaving that aside, and that is though often forgotten, you're absolutely right. And I'm aware of this every day, that, you know, nobody could say that the Jews, I mean, just going back to my parents' generation, never mind my grandparents, had exactly an easy time of being the ethnic minority that they were. But they were white in Europe anyway, and that, I think, made it, quote unquote, easier for them to migrate. I think because of, you know, this dreadful tendency of human beings to look at skin color and to look at such characteristics and be so profoundly influenced by them, it is therefore all the harder for those who aren't, who in addition, from very, very deeply rooted cultures, and in addition, you know, get looked at and judged for their skin color. I imagine, I think about this all the time, that it's even harder.
Yeah.
So yes, I think I agree with that point.
That's terrific, Simon. And I mean, because, you know, to me, you sound for all the world like a thoroughly Englishman.
Absolutely.
You speak Queen's English, and you've got good manners, and you're a nice gentleman.
I'm on good behavior.
I want to come back to the book and ask you a question. We're coming close to the end, so I want to make sure I get this question in. People following the festival often get interested in writing. They see authors, hear authors, and they think, oh, I want to write a book. And very often, the book that people want to write is a kind of memoir, not a celebrity memoir, but rather,
sure.
Many people have realized that, that once their parents are dead, they didn't ask them enough questions. They didn't get the story. And one of the things we do in writing groups is encourage people who have any kind of aptitude to write it down, because your kids and your relatives won't listen to you while you're alive, but they become dead interested, forgive the pun there, in your story after you're dead. And I want to ask you, we've already talked about the ideas that this book generates, but I wondered what it did, the universal ideas that it generates, but I wonder what it did for you, Simon May, writing in such personal detail about your story. Was it a form of therapy? How do you feel now?
It probably was a form of therapy, whatever that really means. I mean, the sense that all writing is a form of therapy and a form of working yourself out through self-expression, if I could use that hackneyed phrase. I had reservations about, I did actually write about half of it 10 years ago and the other half more recently. And I had great reservations about writing it, let alone publishing it, because I just couldn't figure out in me what the ethics were of recounting the stories of others, however sympathetically. And as I said, even in my opening remarks, I absolutely criticized nobody for anything, even if it's created challenges for me. So I had, and to some degree have, questions about that. But I think that the alternative is that their stories get lost. And providing one tells them, you know, as fairly as you possibly can and as accurately as you possibly can, I think on balance, it's not only, you know, so to speak, a good thing and a justified thing to publish, but I think it gives one, as the inheritor of this, you know, family history, it gives one, yes, a more, or it gave me a more, if you like, settled sense of myself. It didn't resolve the conflicts at all, but it gave, there is a sense in which it gave it a sense of completion, and if I were being pretentious, I would even say a slight sense of redemption. by redemption, I mean that it in some sense justifies and honors the suffering of previous generations and the challenges that they had to face.
I certainly think it does that. It honors them tremendously well. And even though I'm always suspicious of biographical writing, because you're not inside your mother's head or your aunt's head, so how can you know? Nevertheless, you do actually say enough from a personal point of view, so one also gets to know you for it not to be biographical, but also autobiographical. So it's a terrific read in that sense. Simon, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I urge people who are at all interested in what's going on in the world today and what went on in Europe 60, 70 years ago, to get this book, How to Be a Refugee by Simon May. Simon May, the Swindon Festival of Literature, thanks you very much for joining us.
Well, I thank you.
Until we meet again, keep well.
Thank you.